about 4 years ago now, who with our first event was the Prosser Science Expo. And so we've been doing that almost yearly until this year. And then we have been adding other events, including science pubs and children's events and yearly speakers in Prosser and Sunnyside. And so we're just trying to, make sure that other people love science as much as we do. Basically, that we know that there's a lot of fun to be had with it, like with events like tonight. So that's why we were trying to get people together tonight. So we are very thankful for our local brewers who are willing to come and join us tonight, as well as everyone who is interested in the science of brewing. So Ben is our moderator tonight. He is a home brewer, so he has more knowledge than our science group does.
Which
so
isn't to say nearly as much as these fine folk, but we'll do our best.
Exactly. So he's going to take it away.
Okay. Well, thank you, Katie. Yep, my name is Ben, and I live here in Prosser, and I was honored to be asked to do this, to moderate this. I've been homebrewing for about, how old's my son? Basically, I started when my wife was pregnant with him. So we're coming up on 9.5 years now. And it's one of my favorite things about it is every year you get a little better and you learn a little bit more. So I'm very excited to talk to some people that do this for a living. We're going to start off tonight with just a quick overview of the brewing process, brewing 101 for stupids type of thing, because a lot of people, myself included, until got to where I did it my first time, you say a thing like mash. What does that mean? So Gary volunteered to give us the quick 2-minute down and dirty, as little of jargon, but enough jargon to be able to properly talk about it, but give the down and dirty brewing process, kind of grain to glass of that. And then what we're going to do afterwards, the general idea is I've asked each of the brewers here to basically share about something that's really cool about the brewing process that they like, that would be of interest to other people, particularly scientists. What's something fascinating about that? In the meantime, what I'm going to try to do, and I will try to here in 15 minutes as we hopefully have more people come on, if you have questions for them, please put it in the chat, and I will try to be reading the chat. I will try to be compressing questions and finding things like that, and then finding a time, even if it's after all three or if it's after one, to try to find a time to bring the questions forward to each of the brewers, either individually if it's to a specific brewer, or collectively, and let them all answer, because that's one of the fun things about brewing is, I mean, there are wrong ways of doing it, but there is a whole lot of right ways of doing it too. And different people have different approaches and different results. And that's awesome, because beer is awesome in all of its different forms. So I encourage you, most of us, even though it's off camera, if you are of 21 and have a driver, in case, we're all at home. What am I saying? It's COVID year. Enjoy a beer while you listen. If you have questions, again, please put them in the chat. And I think I covered everything. So I guess I didn't introduce everybody, for those of you that haven't. We have Chris Baum from Varietal Brewing in Sunnyside. We have Gary Vegar and his son AJ from Horse Heaven Brewing here in Prosser. And from, I guess it's all on there, we have Jacqueline Beard from Bale Breaker up in Yakima. Those are our three brewers. I guess you're not all technically brew, but you know what I mean. And so, yeah, Gary, if you would, please take it away. Tell us about the basics, Brewing 101.
Okay, this is the brewing process in a thumbnail sketch. And it begins with recipe development. And the brewer creating or building a beer around a set of objectives. And then it is the mixture of the malt, the hops, the water, and the yeast within that particular process. There's two sides of the process, the hot side and the cold side. The hot side begins, as I said, with recipe development and then the milling of the grains, the milling of the malt. And then it's the malt added to water. I'm not going to go into details of the water chemistry and all the different types of malts. It's been said that the brewer creates sugar, and that's what brewers do, create sugar. And that is the interaction between the malts and the waters to create wort. Take the wort, go to your kettle, you boil your wort, you do your additions of hops or whatever other adjuncts that you might be adding. And then out of the kettle, it goes to the cold side of the brewing process, which very simply begins with the cooling of the wort, transferring the wort into a fermenter, and then pitching the yeast. And it is actually the yeast that creates the beer, that makes the beer. The yeast, through attenuation, creates our friend ethyl alcohol and CO2. And that is a very brief thumbnail sketch of the brewing process.
That was impressive. I think I gave you 3 minutes and you did it in about 45 seconds. Could you give me really quick, and me and the listeners, a little more of the basics? I mean, you used a lot of words which I recognize and most of the brewers recognize, but a lot of people might not. You talk about the malts, you talk about, the grain goes here, the water goes here, strains. Can you talk about some of that just a bit more so people can understand when you talk about mash versus attenuation and you know what I mean, all of that kind of stuff?
Well, I think the different brewers and part of the panel are going to speak to the different portions of the brewing process. At least that's my understanding. I know AJ is going to talk a little bit about water, not going deep into water chemistry. I'm going to talk a little bit about yeast selection. I'm not going to go into yeast biology or fermentation chemistry, but I can start there. I can start with the yeast. This is on the cold side of the process. There you might skip over to somebody that's going to speak more about malting or the creation of wort.
Okay, sure.
If I start getting into it too deep, you can't shut me up, Ben. I mean,
okay.
I'll just go on and on and on.
No, that sounds good. I think I got an idea. So, Chris, you were going to talk about malts, if I remember right. Correct? Malt and water? You're muted, Chris.
Yeah, sorry about that.
Okay.
Yeah, I can talk about that.
Okay, well, let me give a really quick overview for people. So one of the first things that you do when you're brewing is you take malted grains and you basically make a tea out of them. You put them in hot water and that pulls out the sugar. I'm just trying to, once again, I'm trying to simplify it down for people that might not understand that process. Chris, take it away.
Okay. So yes, you grow malt, you grow grain in the field, not you, but somebody, a farmer, and then it goes to a malt house, and there in the malting process, what happens is the grain's natural tendency to want to become a plant is utilized. So they bring it up to they hydrate the individual grains to, and it depends on what sort of malt you're making, and those are all, I'm not a maltster, but depending on what sort of malt you're making, you hydrate it, bring it to a particular temperature, let it start sprouting. And so the little rootlets start popping out. And then they drop that into a kiln and agitate it so it knocks those little rootlets off. And during this whole process, they're developing enzymes on the outside of the grain. And in nature, those enzymes would activate the starch. The seed, it has a little cotyledon in it, and it's a little packet of starch. And in order for the plant to use that to become a plant, the enzymes have to convert that starch to sugar, and they have enzymes that develop. So we just use those enzymes to basically do the same thing, except for then we stop that whole process and steal the sugar before the plant can fully grow. I'm not really saying that exactly right, but that's basically how malt is made. It's soaked with water, it's raised to a certain temperature, and then depending on the kind of malt, they'll do different they'll bring it to different sorts of temperatures for different sorts of time to develop more dextrins, which are non-fermentable sugars, or they'll kiln it to different colors so you can get different sorts of colored malts out of it. If you want to make a red ale, say, you might want a really dark malt. If you want to make a lager, you want the lightest color malt that you could possibly get. So after that malt leaves the malt house, it comes to a brewery, and it is ground into, basically it's just shattered. You try to leave the husk on the outside of the barley intact, but you want to shatter the inner starchy part so that the enzymes that are on the outside of the husks can access all that starch and convert all that starch into sugar. And that happens in the mash. So you inject water at various temperatures depending on what you're trying to do, what sort of beer you're trying to make, how fermentable you want to make your wort. And you recirculate water through that, giving all of the enzymes different amounts of time to actually get all of that done. There's two main enzymes that we see in malt, which is alpha and beta amylase. The alpha amylase is what does the bulk of the lifting as far as sugar creation in the mash. So the lower the temp, the easier it is for the alpha amylase to work. There's a range. It starts at about 145 and goes up to about 158. The longer you give it at lower temps, the more fermentable the wort. Then from that point, you run all of that sugary water out of the mash tun into the kettle, like Gary explained, and you boil it. The water, for me, is super interesting, and I don't want to talk too much about chemistry, but I will say that, and we can talk a little bit more about it, but just the overview is, if you think about all the different beer styles that exist in the world, and they're from, most continents have some sort of native beer. All of those styles were determined by the water that was in that particular region where those beers come from. So if you think about English stouts, the reason they tasted the way they did is because of the water profile that those aquifers that those brewers were using were pulling their water out of, which tended to be high in bicarbonates, which works well for a dark beer, so you can get those roasty notes without too much acidity, making it unpleasant to drink. Anyways, I'm kind of rambling at this point, but is that good?
No, that's absolutely fascinating.
Jackie's giving me the thumbs up, so I feel like I'm in there.
No, I loved hearing that, because that's one of the things as a home brewer, I'm following recipes and learning some of my own about the temperatures of malts, but that's something that we don't have as much control over in our little little whatever that we have, as oftentimes some of the major ones do. So it's fascinating learning more about the alpha and beta. I will take it. I'm seeing a few more people in the chat. So in case you didn't hear my introduction, if you have questions, please put them in the group chat, and I will try to then convey them to the brewers, either to the appropriate brewer or to just throw it out there, and whoever wants to answer it can answer it. In the meantime, I will try to ask hopefully interesting questions that I find interesting and engage with that, and we'll kind of continue on. So you were talking about alpha versus beta. The alphas tend to be easier for basically the yeast to turn the sugars into alcohol. Is that what you're talking about?
The alpha amylase is the main enzyme that is creating the accessible sugars for the yeast. The betas are creating some of those I believe I'm saying that right. I'm gonna double check myself here. But
so if like your higher temperature mashes would leave more sugars in the beer, which would leave the beer tasting sweeter.
It's not that it leaves more sugar in there. So if you did a mash at the higher end of the saccharification rest, which would be like 158, and we're talking in Fahrenheit, obviously. The sugar, you're going to create the same amount of sugars, but all of those sugars might not be available as easy for Saccharomyces, which is the Saccharomyces cerevisiae, which is the species of yeast most brewers brew with, to access. They like really easy to access sugars. Some of the other wild yeasts can chew on some things that Saccharomyces cerevisiae can't. And so you can make, and so when we talk about wort in terms of being more fermentable or less fermentable, maybe you want your wort after it's fermented out to have some residual sugar left, like where Jackie works at Bale Breaker, one of their main beers, they like to finish at 2 to 2.5 Plato. In order to achieve that, we know that we need to like dough in at like around 152. And we know that temperature range is going to allow the yeast to, there's going to be some non-fermentable sugars left in there. Yeah, and there's also malts that you can use that kind of just drop those sorts of sugars in there, those high dextrins. So you can kind of build some what we refer to as body, which is basically like residual sugars left in a mash or left in a after a fermentation.
Cool. No, thank you. One of the things I'm going to need a little help with too is I'm wanting to geek out here and ask all these questions, and I realize I have to try to keep things have a modicum of accessibility to people that do not necessarily brew. Andy was curious about the changes to the water, and I would be too. Gary, you said AJ was going to talk a little bit about water.
Yeah.
Is now a good time for AJ to come in and talk a little bit about water, and then we can move on to that. Thank you, Chris. I mean, of course, and for most people, as you're listening, brewing is a really weirdly complex yet really simple it's both at the same time. It's the oldest known recipe that we have as human beings is a beer recipe. They've been doing it for thousands and thousands of years, yet the slightest little ingredient change, the slightest little temperature change completely can change it. So we're going to be going back and forth, and I'm not, Chris isn't claiming to be the malt guy, whatever, but so feel free as we talk about, you'll find all these different processes are interrelated, and we'll try to move back and forth and try to gauge that. And for those of you that are just here to learn and don't know anything about beer, great, sit back and listen. For those of you that want to know more, please put stuff in the chat. But right now, yeah, we'll let AJ talk a little bit about water, and then hopefully, Andy, we can talk about that, because I have actually another question about that too, which I think will be very cool. AJ, take it away.
All right. Yeah, I'm AJ Vegar. Been brewing for about 5 years at Horse Seven Hills Brewery. So I'm probably the newest brewer out of everyone here who's brewing. But for water, water is super important to beer. It's 90% of beer in the final product, and so I just jotted down some basic facts. It's kind of a dry subject, but it's very scientific. So I'll just get going on that. One of the big things about water and brewing is the pH. When you're brewing, the initial water you have, you want the pH to be around 5.2 up to 5.6, depending. And that's pretty critical for getting the enzymes and the sugar conversions and everything to kick off right in the brewing process initially. If the pH is too high, you can extract tannins and bad flavors from the malt. If the pH is too low, you can end up with a tart beer. And the pH can also be affected by the malts used in beer. So like darker beers, they're more acidic, the malt. The darker malts are more acidic, so they can drop the pH by a little bit. So like stouts and porters can work better with harder water. And yeah, that's just a short little blip on pH. The minerals in water are also super important. So like for one thing, you do not want to be using distilled water if you're brewing with all grain, because some of the minerals are important to the yeast fermenting correctly, and so on and so forth. Enzyme conversions also. If you're brewing with extract, you can use distilled water because the minerals will be in the extract, but in a brewery, you're not, it's typically all grain brewing it, as far as I know. And yeah, there is some minerals in the malt that you brew with, but it's not enough to make up for what you want to get from your water. And also, I mean, if you can brew with distilled water, but you have to go through and add all the minerals yourself to get that to work for you. So a couple important minerals that are good minerals to have in your water would be chloride and sulfates. There's a chloride sulfite ratio that affects the flavor of beer. The more chloride, the more malt flavors will shine. It enhances fullness and malt sweetness in the beer. The more sulfate, the more the hops bitterness will shine. These produce a drier beer. So those two are good when used in the right proportions. And then I jotted down a few bad minerals that you do not want in your beer. Chlorine and chloramines. Chlorine is widely used as a chemical disinfectant for protecting city water, so it's in tap water like everywhere. But in beer, it's detectable in amounts as low as 5 parts per billion. And chlorine will leave your beer with a palate-ruining plastic taste. It's not good in any form, really. And chloramines also will prevent yeast from properly fermenting. So those you do not want in there. Prosser water, it's got chlorine in the water. So for us, we use partial street water, depending on the beer, and we'll dilute it with RO water, reverse osmosis waters, to get the chlorine and the other bad minerals out of there. Another bad mineral would be iron. That's more common in like well water. Iron's just a common mineral, most common mineral found in the ground. So well water, you'll get that. It's never desirable in beer. If you have it in your beer, it will leave an inky aftertaste and interfere with proper fermentation. Manganese, also bad. You do not want that in your beer. It affects the flavor as well as the beer's clarity. It will also threaten the health of yeast during fermentation. And the last two I've got for you guys is nitrates and nitrites. Also bad. They'll destroy the flavor of beer. And yeah, you do not want those. So RO water, you filter the water out, you can get rid of a lot of those minerals and such. And yeah, that's my short little fact list on water chemistry.
Cool. Thank you. My first question that I would have, I'm going to pass it on to the other brewers, Chris and Jacqueline. He mentioned what he does to counteract the Prosser water. While Sunnyside and Yakima are similar, would you guys care to talk a little bit about some of the challenges that you deal with water and how you counteract those in your particular beers?
Sure, I'd love to. Great summary, AJ. So we actually use water from Moxie, which is well water. So manganese would be something that we would have an issue with. We also have a pretty high level of carbonates in our water. So we end up doing carbon filtration is mainly, and then that's pretty much all we do. We luckily don't have the same sort of nitrate or nitrite issues that I hear are more prevalent in the lower valley. But we do then basically modify our recipes. We do an annual water test, and then we basically modify our recipes based on what is in the water, in the well water, to be able to have a really consistent product going forward. But for us, the main issue is we just brew quite a bit, and Moxie has a few different wells. So a lot of what we're doing is trying to get real-time data so that we can tell when they have switched wells on us, because like these guys were talking about, mash pH really matters in terms of the enzyme actions. And when they switch wells on us, occasionally it throws off our mash pH quite intensely. So Chris, you want to speak to that too? I know you've got a really different process than we do.
We, Sunnyside has, I think of it as terrible water. It's all well water, and it's being pulled from a number of different wells, any combination of wells at any given time. So there's no regularity to it at all. So we decided to RO our water, reverse osmosis. So it goes through a softener, and then it goes through a carbon filter to remove chlorines and chloramines, which Sunnyside also has because it has high nitrates. And then, yes, we build all of our water for our beers from scratch. So like AJ was talking about, we mostly think about in our hoppy beers the sulfite to chloride ratios, or sulfate to chloride ratios, just for the sweetness to bitterness factor. Yeah. And then for some of our darker beers, we actually will throw in some pickling lime or that sort of thing to kind of bring the pH of those mashes up a little bit, so you're not left with such astringent. And also chalk we'll use sometimes. Anything with bicarbonates.
Wow, this is so cool. I love this. It was asked in chat. Jacqueline, you mentioned you guys test the well once a year. Do you find that that's enough? Does it change month to month throughout by seasons? And this is not just to Jacqueline, this is to any of the brewers here. Obviously, I'm particularly interested in Gary because I'm brewing here in Prosser too. How often does the water change? Is this something you have to maintain constantly? Or obviously, I suppose using the RO process, you guys are, you're already getting it down to zero pretty much all the time.
Yeah, we definitely get a lot of fluctuation, especially in the summer. And we will take a mash or a water pH at the start of the day. I wish we could test more often for minerals in our water. It would be great to know, but we basically use the pH as a way of seeing which well we're pulling from. And then because we have lots of brewing throughout the course of the day, we'll have either 3 or 4 batches throughout the course of the day. The first person kind of sets the tone for the rest of the day where they can see how their mash pHs were. And then for us, something that we'll measure is also our last runnings pH, which would be, we talked a little bit about this in the process, but basically, you bring all the malt and the water together, and then in a system as big as ours, you'll start to pull it off the bottom, and then you'll put more water on top. And the malt itself, or the grain itself, kind of acts as a filter bed. And as you run water through it, and then it comes out the bottom and into the kettle, it will start to pull out sugar, which is what we want, but also flavor compounds. So AJ was talking a little bit about, you don't want your pH to get too high because you'll start to extract tannins, which don't taste very good. They have this kind of grainy, mouth drying character to them. So we are spending a lot of time trying to make sure that our first pH, which is when we bring the water and the grain in right away together, our mash pH, is perfect for enzyme action. But then we also, because we have high carbonate levels in our water, it means our pH is quite high. So as we're running that water through there, we're going to extract a lot of the things that will be buffering the mash and keeping the pH down. So we'll start to see our pH creep up. We want to keep it under 6. It's kind of our control limit. So we spend a lot of time trying to make sure that we have the right amount of buffering agents in there so that we can not only get the right mash pH, but then as we're running water through it, we still have it below that threshold that we want. And that's just something that comes from not having reverse osmosis water. If we did, we would have a lot more control over our pH, etc. But we're using quite a lot of water, we're brewing quite a lot of beer, and that's the way that our system is built.
No, that's awesome. This is so cool. This is so, sorry. Anybody else want to share about water and how you process and deal with that?
I can share a little bit more.
Please.
Since you brew in Prosser, and I've been brewing in Prosser as a home brewer for, I don't know, 9 years, and then commercially here at the brewery for another 12 years. And I'm not a water chemist, so a lot of our recipe formations have been built around the combination of using RO water and, as I call it, street water. The street water is filtered. I mean, we filter it through paper and then carbon again to make sure that we got all the chlorine out of it. And then depending on the beer style, we have mixture calculations, again, based on the art of the brewing process rather than true water chemistry. We mix a proportion of reverse osmosis water and, again, what I call street water. And then depending on the beer style, for instance, if we were doing when we brew a lager, we will use a much softer water, much more RO water than we would with on the other end of the spectrum, like a stout, where we would use more street water, which has more of the minerals, and to reach the objectives that we're trying to reach with a stout. The pH of Prosser water coming out of the tap is very stable, and so's the hardness, so's the minerals. It's very stable. It's not great water, but it's still stable. So the pH coming out of the tap in Prosser for all these years is like 8.1 or 8.2% pH. And then when we mix that with the RO water, and we do use a buffer to drop that pH down to about 5.2, which is optimal for just about all beers. Go a little lower or a little higher, depending on the beer style. And then for the flavor profile and the mouth profile, it is this ratio of, and I can't really, it's not a big secret, but I can't really speak to the chemistry side of it. It is this proportion of street water, Prosser street water, and RO water. And I'll say this, Ben, if Horseheaven Hills Brewery moved locations, I'd have to, we would literally have to do water chemistry to build the water to meet the water parameters that we are currently using here in our location here.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And for those of you that aren't quite getting this, it's also a very different thing. And one of the things that's so cool about this current setup, Gary is in a very different situation than, for example, Jacqueline and hers. Gary is serving pretty much people at his pub and all of that, whereas Jacqueline has to worry about all these beers that are going out all over the nation. I mean, I don't know how big your distribution is. And those are they're just two very different approaches. They both have their constraints and they both have their freedoms. And one of the questions that was asked that I think has kind of answered itself in this. Somebody says it's kind of like bread making, very intimidating at first, but after a while you sort of play it by ear. No, is not really the answer. Brewing, what's the old joke? Farmers make wine, engineers make beer. This tiniest little change really can massively change so many different things about it, which is why in particular larger breweries, which I mean, well, let's face it, quite frankly, even Bale Breaker is not a large brewery in the scope of things. The tiny little differences are to some ways unacceptable. One of the freedoms about the smaller ones is that tiny little differences are part of the quirks and the enjoyments, as Gary mentioned. That's part of what makes Horse Heaven Brewery is it's here in Prosser. And one of the reasons why we can get 3 and 4 brewers together and they all have a good time talking is because they know where they're at and what they're doing is a part of their identity. And that's that identity is secure. No one else is trying to be that.
Yeah, Ben, that's so true. And I want to give a shout out. I really respect the work that Gary and Chris do, because we have multiple batches over the course of the day, which really allows us to make corrections in our mash process, for example. And if you have a smaller system where you're only doing 1 or 2 batches, you got to nail it. You got to get it right that first time. So mad respect for the work that you guys do, definitely.
Well, Jacqueline, while I have you here, and unfortunately, we're blessed to have you. Thank you for joining us here at Jacqueline was a wonderful last minute addition to this. Would you be willing to, we'll talk about the next step. We're moving on into the boil kettle and hops. Would you be willing to talk a little bit about hops and the process of that? Particularly around here, we're in the Yakima Valley. We all grow so many hops. Would you be willing to share a little bit about how that works and then whatever as that aspect that you would like to talk about that as far as Bale Breaker goes?
Sure. I would love to talk about hops. I mean, as you guys know, our ownership is a hop farming family, 4th generation. So we spend a lot of time thinking about hops and how to use them in creative ways and how to use them most efficiently in the process too. So basically what's happened already is we went to the malt house. The grain was sprouted, it came to the brewery, we made some sugar from it using our awesome water chemistry. And then once we used that filter bed and we grabbed all the sugar from it, we put it in the boil kettle. In the kettle, we're basically trying to volatilize off some aromas we don't like. We're trying to bind proteins together so that they fall out of suspension so that we don't have them, so we can have a clearer beer, depending on if you're making a hazy or not. And then you're adding hops probably, because malt, even though it's less sweet than sucrose sugar, you still want some bitterness to balance the sweetness of the malt. And that's what hops do. They're balancing that sweetness by bringing us some bitterness. And then also the hops have wonderful aroma compounds that are bound up in the lupulin oil that give us all of these floral and fruity and herbal, grassy, dank sort of aromas that really bring a lot of flavor to a hoppy beer. In a malty beer, you're going to want to strive for balance, or you're going to want to accentuate those kind of roasty caramel sort of malt characters. In a hoppy beer, you want to do the opposite, where you want the malt to be really on the down low and you want to accentuate the hops. So similar to the rest of the brewing process, we have these kind of 2 different sides. We have a hot side and a cold side. On the hot side, we have the ability to create much more intense bitterness because of the isomerization of alpha acids. So basically, hops have lots of different organic acids, and then we apply heat. This particular acid, the alpha acid, changes shape, and it makes people perceive it as much more bitter. So the earlier that you add hops in the process, basically the more heat you apply to them, the more bitter they're going to taste later. And there are a few different types of bittering compounds that are in hops. I won't quite get into detail. If you guys want, I can talk a little bit more about that, but they basically have slightly different sensory components. So that's what I do at the brewery. I run our sensory program, which does both quality control and also helps with product development. And so there are many different types of bitterness compounds. If you add them on the hot side, they're more intense. If you add them later, they're less intense. And then the other thing that hops bring is aroma, right? So depending on the type of aroma that you're going for, you either can add stuff in the boil and it will accentuate. So something like floral or herbal compounds can sometimes be accentuated if you add the hops earlier in the process, but almost always the aroma compounds are quite volatile. That's why they come up in your nose and you smell them. So you want to add them later in the process. For us, we have a system where we have a 4-vessel system. We mostly use 3. So we have the mash tun, which is where we bring the grain in the water. And then we have the boil kettle, which is where we're doing this boiling process. And then we have a 3rd vessel, it's called the whirlpool. And the point of the whirlpool is mostly to be able to filter, similar to a lot of the process. So you take this hot sugar water that has a little bit of hops in it from the kettle, and you spin it really fast, and a lot of solids settle to the bottom, and it makes a clearer wort or sugar water. But at that time, you can also add some hops, which we do. We add a lot of hops there. And you, depending on the temperature of that process, so like for example, Chris has a system where he can cool down that whirlpool temperature a little bit to maybe somewhere between 160 and 180 degrees, where it's still at sterilization temperature. So you're not worried about getting bacteria into the beer, but it also takes you a little bit below the isomerization temperature, or basically where you apply that heat to the alpha acid and it makes it more bitter. So as a result, you can put more hops in and you'll get less bitterness, which is super cool. I wish we had that in our system. We sometimes try to rig our systems so that we can do something similar, but it's really cool that that's built in. And then you'll cool down the wort. And then you can add hops later too. So I'm sure that Gary's going to talk a little bit more about fermentation and yeast, but just know that when you add hops later in the process, the bitterness we find is a little bit less, it's more round, and there are certain compounds that you can, flavor compounds that you can extract that would otherwise boil off basically on the hot side of the process. And there's a lot to talk about with hops and fermentation. Ben was asking, you know, for like a fun, cool fact about brewing that we think is really interesting. And one thing that I think is super cool about hops is that they actually have some of these same enzymes that the barley has, or the malt has, those amylase enzymes that Chris was talking about, so, which is used totally differently. Instead of the seed germinating, it basically is the hop plant trying to, in the middle of the night, take starches that are stored and then turn them into sugars so it can continue to basically respirate and live in the middle of the night. But from a practical perspective for brewers, it basically means that if we add too many hops later in the process, we actually can create more sugar. So a lot of the techniques that you're seeing with brewers with very highly hopped beers, like hazy IPAs, or even some of the beers that we make that are clear, people are being very strategic about where they're adding their hops because they're creating extra sugar in there in addition to adding flavor compounds in. So if you guys have more questions about hops, I love to talk about them. They're really cool. Yeah.
No, thank you. That is awesome. And I was laughing because you were talking about being jealous of Chris, whereas, you know, most of my brewing equipment was $20 giant pots, you know what I mean, type of thing. So it's the idea of having a whirlpool at all just sounds amazing.
What you're doing in a home brewing system is very challenging, especially in terms of fermentation temperature control, which so impacts your flavors.
You make do. You make do with it, and you just have fun with it. So yeah, no, now would be a good time to ask questions. As Jacqueline talked about, hops are huge, particularly around here, and particularly in the Northwest. You know, Seattle and Portland have really cultivated and changed the brewing, society around the world with all of their use of hops, both growing. One of my good friends is the farm manager for one of the bigger hop farms around here. And, you know, the hop farms are constantly developing new types of hops, which are bringing out new flavors. And I mean, literally every year they're coming out with multiple types of new hops. I would say, Jacqueline, is there anything particular you want to talk about a new hop? And then I would pass it off to Gary and Chris. If you guys want to talk about something, add something with hops. By the way, thank you, Jacqueline. You did a great job with a good overview of that aspect of it.
Thanks. Yeah, I would love to talk about some new hops. We were actually just talking about this today with the beer that I'm drinking right now, which is our Hazy Ale IPA, which just won a silver medal at the Great American Beer Festival. It's our first one. I'm really excited about it.
Congratulations.
Thank you. So yeah, I mean, they're constantly, it's about a 10-year process from when they make the first cross, so basically a male and a female plant, to when they bring a hop to commercial production. It takes quite a long time. And I forgot to tell you guys, hops are the female flower of the hop plant that has not gone to seed yet. It's an immature flower. So basically all the hops that you see out there growing in the Yakima Valley are hopefully all females, except for the ones that are part of our breeding stock, that are part of the breeding program. So what really differentiates this beer, and I think makes it really cool, is that we used a fair amount of Neo-Mexicanus hops, which is kind of this new type of hop that has some of its genetic material from hops that are from the American Southwest. And they tend to have this really tropical sort of aroma profile that sometimes is also quite woody or like coconutty or like coconut husks. So this particular beer is dry hopped, which means we added hops during the fermentation process or afterwards once the beer is cool, with Sabro, which is a Neo-Mexicanus hop. So it has this kind of cool coconutty sort of flavor. And that really, I think, is one of the biggest innovations that's happened in hops in the last 15 years, where they brought in these hops that are native to the US and started breeding them. And I anticipate, Sabro is kind of one of the first that has the most of that Neo-Mexicanus flavor, which is the cultivar Neo-Mexicanus. Talus is another one that was just released, which also has that like really intense kind of coconutty cedar character, like cedar wood. But I anticipate that as they continue to kind of breed it with some of the other hops that we really know and love, like Mosaic or Citra, that have a lot of fruity flavors, we're gonna get some really interesting stuff happening. So I'm excited for the future of hop breeding for the next 5 or 10 years.
Nice. One of the quick questions that the people have, are all the hops you use from the Yakima Valley? The numbers that I have heard from this, which I know are rough, but approximately 75% of the hops in the US are grown within about 30 miles of Toppenish. And the US grows approximately 75% of the world's hops. So the answer is yes. We grow all the hops here. I mean, literally all the hops here. Yes, there are some German hops and some in Europe, but tell me if I'm wrong, if any of the other brewers use any hops really that aren't grown around here. I don't think there's really a whole lot. Chris, Gary, do you care to add anything to the hop things? Anything that's cool?
Yes, I'll add on. First, kudos to the Yakima Valley hop growers. For many years, a lot of the hops that were coming out of the Yakima Valley were alpha hops for the big factory brewers. And since I've been in this business for 12 years and before, there are so many new hop developments in the aroma varieties of hops that, speaking for the growers, I'm not a grower, obviously, but it is a tough business. People like to have their favorite beer, but the craft brew crowd is always looking for something new. And thanks to the growers that come up with these different hop varietals, there's typically something new and cool coming down the pipe in the Yakima Valley. That said, the majority of the hops that we use at Horse Heaven are grown here in the Yakima Valley and the Pacific Northwest, but primarily the Yakima Valley. I'm a traditionalist in certain varietals that I still buy from off the continent. So when we're doing our our English beer, which is Ruby Spur, we use a specific hop. It's Kent Goldings, and I I'm a traditionalist, and I prefer to buy Kent Goldings from Britain. And when we do a lager or a pilsner, we will choose a couple of varietals known as noble variety hops. Hallertau that comes from Germany, Zatz or Zaz that comes from Czechoslovakia. And I've been using those several hops for a long time in brewing. You can grow grow Goldings here in the Yakima Valley, or you can grow Hallertau here, and then it turns into kind of a food fight, an argument with growers on, for instance, Hallertau, German Hallertau versus American Hallertau. What is the superior Hallertau variety? And just doing a traditional German style lager, I still buy German Hallertau, and I still buy Czechoslovakian Zatz or Kent Goldings from Britain. But most of all the other varietals, the rest of them, they just simply all come from the Yakima Valley.
Thank you, Gary. Chris, do you have anything you would like to add to this?
We brew, so kind of like our whole thing is brewing with everything. We do use a lot of hops from Yakima because, like I say, a lot of hops come from here. We also brew with a lot of hops from New Zealand and Australia. They've been producing some pretty exciting flavors and aromas over there. We've also been lucky enough, there's a kind of a burgeoning hop growing region in South Africa. And those hop farms are small and they're not producing a lot, but we've been able to get our hands on some, and they're creating some really unique flavor compounds, strawberry being a big one that's kind of prevalent in a lot of those hops, which is a tough aroma to get in beer at all. So that's been really fun, playing with those things. And of course we get European hops infrequently, just because the quality of our hops here in the Yakima Valley is very high. And
I think he just called you out, Gary.
No, it's not that. It's not that at all. I'm just saying,
I told you it could be a fight.
it's not that. It's just the beers that we make call for, different. We're not super traditional in our beers, so don't need to stick to traditional.
No, I'm sorry, Chris. I didn't mean to throw you off. I thought it was funny.
But I will, sometimes, for our international lager, I do want a clean, noble kind of hop characteristic. So I do tend to use the U.S. grown and U.S. cultivated hops that have those same sorts of qualities. That's just a artistic decision we've made.
And I'm hoping that as you guys are all listening to this, that's I've said it before, and I just want to keep reiterating it. That's one of the reasons why there are 80 breweries in Portland, and there are a dozen breweries here in the Valley. It's all good, and everybody likes doing their stuff, and that's why even though there's so many great breweries, we still do some home brewing because it can be a very personal thing. You make what you like, and that's what makes it awesome. One of the questions that now I can come back to, yes, I was really curious about this. So so now that we're on this topic, Yakima grows a huge amount of hops, a huge amount of great hops. When I was going to college, I went to college over in Portland. I'm from Prosser, but I went to college over in Portland. There were a ton of breweries in Portland, and it has not been until the last, maybe 10 years, arguably even less than that, 5-8 years, that quality breweries have started popping up here. in the Yakima Valley, of which a good chunk, if not the majority of them, are represented here tonight. We're lucky enough to have. Why do you think it took the Yakima Valley so long to start bringing in breweries when places that weren't growing hops, weren't growing malts, had no other reason to do it, had, like Seattle and Portland, had hundreds of breweries?
Well, I think honestly, like Yakima was one of the first places in it was the first place in the U.S. to have a craft brewery with Burt Grant. It took everybody else that much time to catch up. But you know, there's like people like what they like, and if you know, you kind of have to like get a population of people to sign on for a thing and for it to be cool and to develop the relationship to a product. The first brewery that I mentioned is Burt Grant's, it was Grant's Pub, or I think that's what it was. Gary may remember better than me. I was not living here at the time. But yeah, Burt Grant had the first brew pub in the US post-prohibition. And it was right downtown Yakima. So, and then he had a larger production brewery over off Washington and like 3rd. And the building's still there. You can see it. It's a box factory or something now, but
like gravity fed brew house.
Yeah. You want to read a really interesting book, read Burt Grant's book. It's fun. Anyways, that's my point is, you know, and if you talk to people who have lived in Yakima for a long time, I myself moved here in 2008, so I'm sort of relatively new. People will wax on and on and on about how great Burt Grant's beer was. My feeling is that if they were drinking Burt Grant beer as he was making it back then, if they drank it today, they might feel differently. But people, you know, the palate, they were looking for something new and fresh and different and flavorful that wasn't just yellow fizzy beer, industrial macro lagers. So.
That's fascinating. I've not heard anything about that. Gary, Jacqueline, do you care to chime in on this?
I think your question is why brewery development was slower in the Valley or Southeast Washington and in other areas. And I think Chris said it best. People like what they like. When we started a dozen years ago, Horse Heaven in Prosser, there was actually as many craft brewers in Prosser as there was in Yakima at the time, or Spokane. Of course, that's changed dramatically. When I started to invent and create beer to sell in Prosser, the beers that I chose to invent and create were what I would consider transitional beers. And it was primarily moving people off of factory beer, you know, stuff that I grew up on, Olympia or Rainier or.
Don't be dissing Vitamin R, Gary. Seriously,
Yeah,
I will mute you right now.
Well, it was, you know, when we started professionally and we're literally selling beer in Prosser, I mean, we've never distributed really. We had to create beers that were transitional to move people away from the factory brew to craft brew. And we did it softly with beers like Honey Girl, you know, a real clean honey ale, or Ruby Spur, a real clean English style beer, the stout, so on and so forth. And as people's palates have developed in Southeast Washington, so goes the beer. You know, you see, you know, things that, you know, the beers that Varietal are doing are just off the chart. I mean, I wouldn't dare do that kind of stuff a dozen years ago because there just wasn't that many people around that were where you're going to be able to sell it to. And so it's the evolving, the evolution of the beer drinker. And again, I think Chris said it best. People like what they like.
Fair point. Jacqueline, anything to add to this?
You guys saw my cat La Gordita came into the frame. She likes to be part of the video action.
It's a Zoom meeting now. There's a cat here.
Hey. Yeah, you know, I'm fairly new to the Valley as well. I moved here in 2011. And yeah, I think that the people were hungry for more great breweries, and I'm happy that we're all meeting that demand.
Yep, absolutely, absolutely. We've had a couple questions that haven't fit anything into this, so I have heard those. Thank you for asking them, like John. I'm going to come to those at the end because we have one more. We're just going to let Gary talk a little bit about yeast, which is the last process. So a quick reminder, you know, we've taken the malts, we've run the water through them. It's gotten the sugar water basically out of it. We're boiling that and adding the hops, which creates basically, you know, all these different flavors that we're looking at. Now we're cooling it off and adding yeast. Gary, do you have a little bit that you would like to talk to, something cool, interesting about the yeast aspect of it?
Yeah, I'm gonna speak to choosing yeast and the process of choosing yeast. I'm not going to go into yeast biology or the chemistry of fermentation, which are huge subjects. And so I'm going to speak a little bit about yeast, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the process of choosing yeast. So more than any other fermented beverage, beer depends on yeast for flavor and aroma. Some historians believe that civilization developed from a desire to drink beer. I tend to agree with those historians. No yeast, no beer, no civilization. So for most of civilization, nobody really understood the natural occurring yeast was critical to creating fermentation. Fermentation was a divine mystery. And it wasn't until the 1860s with Louis Pasteur, that established yeast as a living organism. And that opened the gates for precisely controlling the conversion of sugar into alcohol. Beer went from something magical with little control to something that the brewer could control by simply understanding yeast. And this led to the controlling of the off flavors as well, caused by bacteria, solved by sanitation, cleaning yeast cultures, and sanitizing and cleaning breweries. Those were all huge developments in beer as a business. And it was Hansen from Carlsberg Laboratories that isolated the first known lager yeast, Saccharomyces uvarum. And with the development of lager yeast, this was just a huge part of the business, because lager is fermented cooler at 50 or 55 degrees, which suppressed the growth of bacteria. And what that meant is a longer shelf life, and business-wise, what that meant was a much larger distribution area and increased sales. So fermentation, as we know, takes place on the cold side of the brewery process. We've chatted about the hot side: recipe, design, milling, mashing, boiling, and then hops. The cool side begins with the cooling of the wort and adding the yeast, and that's the cool side, basically. And throughout this process, on the cool side, not so much on the hot side, although it's important, sanitation on the cool side is just absolutely critical. So getting to what I'm really driving at here is the yeast strain is critically important to everything related to fermentation. Like people, yeast has distinct personalities. It's the temperature and wort condition, the pH, the oxygen level that control the level of attenuation. Attenuation is the conversion from the yeast converting the sugar into alcohol. And again, I'll say it again, on the cool side, sanitation is just absolutely critical. So an interesting thing about what brewers do, brewers create sugar. We create the wort. Yeast makes the beer. A brewer can take a wort and use two different, completely different yeasts, and you're going to have two completely different beers just by choosing different styles of yeast. So the selection of yeast is like, it's like kind of like building a house. There's many similar components of the house, but by different using different materials, you're going to have just a complete different house. So it is with beer. So what you're trying to build with beer is you're trying to meet your sensory objectives. And we talked a little bit about it earlier. You know, what are the objectives? Dry, hoppy, sweet and malty, clean or estery, high in alcohol or low in alcohol. The brewer has that feel for what they are trying to create, and then begin finding strains that might work in that particular style. So beer style, beer considerations when you're choosing a yeast. One of the things you're looking at, and there's about 5 things you want to pay attention to. Attenuation, that's the percentage alcohol that's going to be converted from the yeast. The flavor profile, talked a little bit about that. Flocculation is huge. Yeast flocculates, it clumps together. There's 2 different versions of that, a lager yeast or an ale yeast. I'll talk a little bit more about that. The reliability of yeast is critical. You got to have a reliable supply. Are you building it in-house? Are you ordering it? Cost is a huge part of it. And then the working temperature range that your brewery, are you creating ales which are fermented warmer? Are you creating lagers which are fermented cooler? So beer style is important. It's determined by a combination of grains, hop, yeast, and water. And yeast, I'm going to say this again, yeast doesn't get talked about a lot. You know, we talk about malts, we talk about water, and of course we talk about hops a great deal, but yeast just plays a huge role in the character of the beer. So your average beer consumer will divide beer into ale or lager. And but there's dozens of hybrid styles. So the beer judge certification program recognizes 80 something distinct beer styles. There's always new ones coming along. 80 something distinct beer styles in about 23, 24 different categories. Now, the yeast suppliers, where the brewers go to buy yeast, the yeast suppliers identify their yeast as either ale or lager for starters. And then they further identify the strains by, typically it's by geographical location, by country, by region, by city. So if a brewer wants a Belgian style beer, you start identifying Belgian in the description, and you go from there, like a German style lager or an English style ale. This is the easy part of creating styles. And this, you know, by purchasing yeast from geographical areas, that's going to get you in the ballpark. And then there's further characterization of yeast. Both ale and lager. On the ale side, it starts with clean, very popular in the States. Very clean ales in the United States, very popular. That's what I was talking about in Horse Heaven a dozen years ago or longer. We developed clean style ales, those transformation beers, to move people from factory beer to the craft beer program. Fruity ale, something that you, well, English style comes to my mind. There's more fermentation character. There's hybrid category, and that's ale yeast that is fermented cool, like a lager. And a couple of beers that come to mind that fit that profile are like German alt beer or German Kolsch. It is a ale yeast that is fermented cool, and it just creates a different flavor profile and real clean. There's the phenolics, the phenolic ales. I want you to think about like German Weizen beers, wheat beers. And one that comes to my mind is like a real nice German Hefeweizen. So when I say phenolics, what I'm speaking to is if you're thinking of a classic German Hefeweizen, that spicy clove, that fruity banana flavor. Those are phenolics, a phenolic beer. You see that in Belgian ales as well. Then there's the eccentric ale strains that super high gravity. Belgian wit beer is an example of that. Lots of phenolics, lots of esters, fusel alcohols, earthy, sour flavors. If you drink Chimay from Belgium, that's an example. Then you get into the lager yeast, which is the bottom fermenting versus the top fermenting yeast, which is kind of misunderstood even by some brewers. And what we're talking about is flocculation. What I'm speaking of is during the fermentation process, yeast will flocculate together. Now, generally speaking, ale yeasts are good flocculators. They clump together, and then what happens is those clumps of yeast will follow the CO2 bubbles up, and so it's considered a top fermenting yeast, whereas lager yeast, again, not talking about the chemistries, they don't flocculate very well. They're known as bottom fermenters, but it's not really about fermenting off the bottom. It's just that they don't clump together and they don't rise to the top. Lager yeast works slower than ale yeast, and it produces fewer esters and fewer fusel alcohols. Lagers, you ferment in temperatures about 50 to 55. We ferment our ales, we ferment our lagers here about in that temperature range. In our ales, I like to go about 10 degrees higher, 65 to up to 70. You know, I personally like a cooler fermenting ale because it just comes out cleaner. Anyway, I'm digressing. The lager yeasts fall into two basic categories. You've got the cleaner. They're both clean, but the German lagers are drier, they're crisp, they're a little higher in hops, a little more bitterness to them, but just drier, cleaner, and crisp. The maltier ones, known as typically Munich lagers, are a little more maltier, a little more sweetness, a little more rounder, they're a little more complex. That's just a thumbnail sketch on lager yeast. And then some brewers use multiple styles of yeast in the same beer. Personally, we don't do it here. Just a word on, Chris may speak to this, but Betromyces. Sorry, Ben, I mispronounced that. I'll just call it Brett for short, used in secondary fermentation. Belgian beers use this. Orville uses it to produce a secondary flavor. You'll find Brett in Lambic or Flanders or so on and so forth. There's, I'm not going to get into it, but what makes Brett special, it's called the custard effect, and it's the inhibition of alcohol and fermentation in the absence of oxygen. I don't want to get into chemistry. One of the reasons many wineries worry about Brett is that it can consume the wood sugars present in oak barrels, which causes some really funky off fruity flavors. Then there's this whole other category of wild yeast that I'm not going to speak.
We actually have, believe it or not, some questions about wild yeast, but it's okay. Yeah. You don't need to get into it.
Okay. Now. Yeah, I can answer some questions. I don't use wild yeast. I like to read about it. And maybe Chris has been doing some of that. There's some really cool breweries that have been doing things with Brett and with wild yeast. If I did that in Horse 7, I would have to, in Prosser, I would have to be more of a distributor because there's just not that big of a
That
demand.
is absolutely correct. You are
There's not
absolutely
that big of a
100%.
demand in
People would
Prosser. Get
taste this
out
and
of
go
that.
like, what are you trying to sell me,
Yeah,
Gary?
get out of that box. And we would be doing beer that would work like this. Hey, that's really good, Gary. That is really good. Give me $1 off, or give me
Yeah,
100.
exactly. Exactly.
So
So
in,
to sum up what
summary,
Gary's saying, outside of the wild yeast, yeast is huge. This is huge. We could do a multiple part series of the science on yeast alone. I mean, there are so many different strains. It's such a living thing that, I mean, we talked a little bit about how the water changes day to day, season to season. You know, for those that are trying to do something even within the day, the pH can change. Yeast is a living thing, and as we all know that have kids or pets, it's very difficult to control living things in the way that we wish we sometimes could. That's one of the things that keeps brewers going throughout the years is, holy crap, this thing I thought I knew, all of a sudden it's ever so slightly different. And just like living things, you have to treat it slightly differently. Jacqueline, Chris, would you care to add anything to some of your personal experiences with some of the cool yeast things or something with that? Okay, fine. Jacqueline, you go first. I'll pick.
Sweet. Yeah, that was a great overview, Gary. We've been playing with a little bit of interesting yeast strains. So we have basically 2 main yeast strains that we brew most of our beers with. We just added a third, which is a lager yeast strain. We use a Kolsch strain for our hazy IPAs, and then we have a Chico yeast, or an American ale yeast, that makes most of our beers. And definitely, you're so right, like the same recipe with a different yeast is completely different. Up to even the amount of haze that it can leave in the beer. Part of the reason we use a Kolsch yeast strain is because it creates, whether it's manoproteins or some sort of haze forming agent that's incredibly stable in the beer that we don't get with our Chico ale yeast, for example. But wild yeasts are super interesting too. We have a small barrel program at Bale Breaker where we play mostly with Brettanomyces. But I used to work in the wine industry before I moved into brewing, and there's a lot of really interesting wild yeasts that are not very alcohol tolerant. So a lot of the time, if you're doing some sort of mixed fermentation, like I think Chris does sometimes where he uses whole fruit in the cold side of the process, and in that case, you're going to get this kind of cool low level effect from a lot of those wild yeast, which will die off once the alcohol gets fairly high. But they're going to contribute some flavor in the meantime, which is really cool.
Chris, care to run with that?
Yeah, wild yeast. We brew with a lot of different yeasts. We use a lager yeast. We use an ale strain, and we use kind of a new. It's not new. It's been around for hundreds of thousands of years, maybe. I don't know. It's comes from the northern parts of Europe, called Kvik, or some people call it Queek. And it's a strain that was developed. There's lots and lots of different kinds of it. It's like a farmhouse strain. They're like what do they call it? Norwegian farmhouse ales. And they were just these strains of yeast that people brewing at home, home brewers, who were brewing beer for the health benefits of it, on their farms, developed, and we've been able to
do that, y'all. Home brewing is healthy. Get in on that.
They've been able to capture those things and breed them up, and so right now there's kind of this huge surge of brewers using these crazy strains. They don't tend to behave like Brettanomyces, like Gary was saying, that you can have issues with over attenuation when you get Brett involved in a clean beer. We do a lot with Brett, and we're starting to play with Kvik and Brett together. It's kind of what that can do. So anyways, the Kvik we're really excited about. Going into sour beers, there's a couple, it's not just yeast at play in there. You also have Pediococcus, which is a lactic acid producing bacteria, as well as Lactobacillus, which is another lactic acid producing bacteria. And those, instead of making alcohol, they produce lactic acid. And sometimes I think there are some strains that also do produce alcohol, but that's where if you drink a sour beer, that's what gives the sourness to it, in addition to things like acetobacter, which is what vinegar producers use to produce vinegar. You can also get some like vinegar notes to add layers of complexity in the beer. These are all dangerous games to play in a clean brewery. We take a lot of precaution. We do play with them, but we also take a lot of precautions to try to keep them out of our regular production.
Yeah. And for those of you that don't know, I realize we haven't actually said this. When particularly, obviously, commercial breweries are using it, they have very specific yeast strains that they have either developed or purchased. And they are very particular about cleaning all their equipment. And when they introduce this yeast strain to their wort, that is the only thing that is going into the wort. When people talk about wild yeast, it's a bit of a spectrum. Sometimes there are specific yeasts that tend to have multiple types that they dump in. Sometimes on the furthest other end of the spectrum, they literally take the wort and you stick it out, and whatever wild yeast, because there's even in our houses there's yeast floating around. Whatever wild yeast gets in it. That's what it is. And some of the first beers, that's the way they were made. Obviously, as Chris just said, you can see how when they're expected to put out a product that has supposed to have these expected flavors, just leaving all your wort open to whatever gets in is a very dangerous thing to do.
Yeah. And it's in your brew house too. So you have to do a lot of work. And this is what Jackie spends a lot of time doing, is making sure that the brewery itself is relatively free of these other organisms that can, spoilage organisms they call them, or spoilage bacteria. Anyways, we play with a bunch of those things. They produce, the fun thing about Brett that it is able to do that other yeasts are not able to do is it will live for a really, really long time. And for the most part, like the beer yeast that we normally use to make like an IPA or a lager, the yeast will consume the sugar. Once they're done, they'll bind together, they'll drop out, and they're done. You can reuse those yeasts. You can give them fresh wort or sugar food, and they will, grow again. But Brett, when you put it into a package, will consume all of the sugar, and then when it's done with that, it'll start consuming some of the other metabolites that it created. In addition to alcohol and CO2, it's creating a whole bunch of other flavor compounds. And so what's fun about a sour beer is you can drink one, you can brew one, put it in a bottle, let it sit. You can drink one bottle fresh, and it tastes completely different from what it'll taste, say, 5 years down the road. So that's what is really fun about sour beer brewing, is watching these things change over time as the Brett just continues to work throughout the years. Eventually it does kind of just loses its viability and stops working, but yeah, it's pretty awesome. And then if you have do with like a co-fermentation or mixed fermentation, the other microbiology, other small life in there that's making other flavor compounds, the Brett will also eat that stuff and turn it into other things. So it's pretty awesome. And the brewers who are sour beer brewers over, especially in Europe, Belgium especially, are masters of understanding what their house cultures do over time, and they'll build their beers they'll think about beer not in terms of like once it's packaged, they're thinking about the beer 12 years down the road. It's pretty
Cool.
rad.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah.
We have we've done the whole process. I think for those of you that have been here the whole time, we've gone from grains to finished beer. As you can hopefully tell, I mean, we have skimmed the surface on what brew making actually is, but for one evening, I think we've done a pretty good job. I'm going to open it up now. If you have any last couple questions, we'll try to just, I have a few that are here that we've missed throughout the thing. And if you have any others, now's the time to put it in, because I think we're going to kind of start wrapping it up here pretty quick. While I have you here, Chris, one of the questions that we had earlier says that the Varietal's been working on a Gose. Is that how you pronounce it? Gose-like beer? G-O-S-E?
The people say Gosa.
Gosa? Okay.
German style of light, sour, salty beer. We don't make a Gosa. We do make a light tart wheat ale that we use for a blending for doing different fruit infusions and stuff. But yeah, we don't make a Gosa.
No, I Googled it because I'd never even heard of it, and I thought that was fascinating.
I'd like to make a Gosa. We do make our light sour wheat ale is in the style of the Berliner Weiss, which is a light kind of summer German beer that they mix with different raspberry syrups and woodruff and other syrups, and it's highly carbonated, and it's drunk. And it's kind of like like you go on a hike and you end up at a little bar and you'll drink this and it'll be refreshing. It's not high in alcohol. They're like 3.2% generally. So we have a base that we use to do things like we mix with some fruits and stuff like that. But I have not yet made a Gosa.
Okay. Huh. No, that's cool. Thank you. One of the other questions I realized in all of our big talk of pHs and yeast strains, somebody simply asked, what makes a stout a stout? There you go. Open it wide up.
The style guidelines generally lay those things out by mouthfeel, alcohol percentage. There's a number of. The difference between a stout and a porter generally is ABV and mouthfeel. But maybe somebody else has some other thoughts on that.
The stout and porters are close cousins. A lot of it has to do primarily with roasted barley in proportion. When I think of a stout, I'm thinking of roasted barley, black malt, which is just simply barley that's just burnt to about 400 degrees. Chris mentioned mouthfeel. That's critical. And as Chris was talking about temperatures of the mash, when you're doing a stout, typically you want to have more unfermentable dextrin in there. It adds to mouthfeel, which typically means you're going to be mashing a little higher temperature to get more dextrin. And then roasted malts, black malt, roasted barley. There's of course all different kinds of stouts. There's milk stouts where lactose is, I personally prefer a nice classic Irish dry stout. Has some dark crystal in there, some roasted barley, some black malt, and some colored barley. Not like Pilsen or just a little darker barley. And then personally, I like mine on nitrogen, like Guinness, and again, that just adds mouthfeel. Finer bubbles.
Excellent. I think we've covered most everything that I've seen. I'm going to leave you each with one quick question to each of our brewers. First of all, thank you, Jacqueline, Chris, Gary, and AJ, so much for giving your time tonight. You didn't you didn't have to do this, and we just truly appreciate you coming, sharing all your top secrets, and for each of you that tuned in, we really appreciate it. The one question I'm going to leave you with, this is really digging into the nitty gritty. What's your favorite type of beer? We're just going to leave it at that. What is your favorite type of beer currently? We'll say right now, because mine I know changes via season. What is your favorite fall beer or beer that you would recommend? You can use this if you need to. Great, go ahead and promote your own brewery. But more than that, I'm genuinely curious of what's your favorite beer right now? And then feel free to say your kind of good nights to everybody else. Ladies first. Jacqueline?
I had to think about this one. So I find this time of year, after we've just gotten done with fresh hop season, I'm a little bit burnt out on hops. So the two things that I've been drinking lately mostly are, we just put out a Pilsner, clean, crisp. I'm also remodeling my basement right now. It's a great beer to drink while you're working on some sort of project, but not with power tools, kids. Yeah, so I'm drinking a lot of that, and then when I get done drinking that and I want something a little more flavorful, we have a bunch of really cool whiskey barrel aged beers, including one that is a real weird style that was a collaboration with a cidery in Oregon called Lionheart Graf. And the Graf style is basically part cider, part beer, and it just kind of tastes like pumpkin spice. So that's a weird one. I'm really enjoying it. It's got a lot of flavor and a lot of whiskey character too. Yeah, thank you guys so much for paying attention and for all of your questions. It's been really fun to chat with you, and you're welcome to reach out in the future if you guys have more questions.
Thank you, Jacqueline. Chris?
Right now I'm drinking quite a bit of lager, and I've been drinking a lot of dark beer recently too. I think we're getting ready to do some blending of some of our whiskey barrel stouts, and thinking about those. So I'm trying to drink through some things. We have some projects coming up that require some barrel aging. So been doing my research, as they say. Funny thing about Graf is, I believe, and I could be wrong about this, but I believe it was invented by Stephen King.
Yeah, it was. And it has this like lore that like, oh, this is an ancient British style because like British cideries and also beer, but no, it was totally invented by Stephen King. So, we're trying to just make him proud.
That's awesome.
That is amazing. Thank you very much, Chris. Gary, what are you drinking?
Well, currently, I'm drinking fresh hop. This is Horseheaven Hills Brewery Buck Off, our standard IPA made with fresh Citra. That they're not green hops. When I prefer, when I do a fresh hop, I mean, we do use green hops, wet hops, but I prefer the flavor of a fresh hop, literally on the floor right out of the kiln. And that's what these are. These are Citra. And it made just a magnificent fresh hop beer. My standard answer, Ben, when somebody asks me, what's your favorite beer, is the one in front of me. And the one in front of me right now is the fresh hop. When I visit breweries, particularly new breweries that I haven't been to before, craft breweries, I usually start with a lager or a Pilsner. And I like a good lager. I like a good Pilsner. I spoke about it earlier on selection of hops. There's so many wonderful beer styles, the Belgians, the sours that Chris, these guys are playing around with at Varietal. But when I go to a new brewery, I start with their lager. Why? Because you get a really good temperature reading of the brewer. And if a brewer can do a classic lager and a classic pilsner and it comes out right, then you know that you're onto a good brewery, a good brew house. There's nothing to hide behind. There's no sourness. There's no cool flavor profiles from all the different phenolics. It's just a good, clean lager. I still enjoy them, and good ones, as far as I'm concerned, are right up there in the beer world.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Gary. And again, thank you to all three. And thank you for everybody that came out tonight. I believe we are pretty much done here. Katie, do you have anything else to say?
Nope, that's pretty much it. Thank you very much for everyone for presenting and for coming. If you want to reach out to the Science Exploration Group with any questions, we are scienceinthevalley@gmail.com, or there's always the Facebook group. And look for more events in the future, because we hope to bring people together again with fun stuff like this in the future.
And Katie, I know I have at least 2 people that reached out to me that couldn't come tonight. Where can we find the VOD from this for people that are interested in watching this?
So we need to figure that out. Because apparently this is video files are very large, and Facebook isn't as hospitable as we were hoping. So it will probably end up being on YouTube, but check the event and we will post a link in the future.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
Right. Thanks so much, Ben, for hosting this, and thank you, Jacqueline and Gary and Chris, for being our guests. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having us.
It's a pleasure to chat with you guys.
You guys come back and do stuff at the brewery when we're able to.
We will. Cheers.
Adios.
Cheers. Good night, y'all.
Good night.
Right.
Bye.